My name's Paul Sims. I'm chairman at eyeforpharma, calling you today from London. And welcome to today's webinar, which is called Blockchain as Pharma's Trust Catalyst, as you can see right in front of you. And this has actually been a very popular topic. We've had close to 1,300 people signing up, which is very interesting. And I found we normally get those kind of numbers when we run a webinar on, say, customer experience or patient support programs. But actually, this is a topic which very few of us have really even considered or thought about in a huge amount of detail. And in many ways, it's something of a concept still. But I think that what you'll see over the course of the next hour is that this is something that is moving swiftly beyond the conceptual. So the tagline here, how we can redefine relationships with customers and patients, and you'll see very much how we can do that. And this has been an area which I think has incited far more debate than previous webinars that I've put together. I apologize to any of you who've written to me, and I haven't had a chance to reply, but there's certainly been a huge amount of attempts and a huge amount of debate. This is obviously your chance to be part of the conversation. You can see we have 4 lovely panelists who are going to speak with us in just a second. But do, if you can, use the questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen and be as active as you can. In fact, if you wouldn't mind, just say a quick hello to me right now in order that I can tell that you're all listening to me and no one's fallen asleep already. And then I know that everything's going okay, cool, getting some hellos in there. So now you know where the questions box is. Please make it your friend. I'd like to really make this not just a conversation with the people on the panel, but with all of you. So do indeed be a part of that. So who have we got today? You can see, as I said, we've got 4 lovely people. On the top left is Richie Eswari, and he is the CEO of Humanity.co. Many of you will know him already. He was until recently the Chief Digital Officer at IQVIA. I was fortunate enough to do some great work with him there. But in the short period since leaving, he's actually gone a huge distance in establishing Humanity.co. And it's made some pretty impressive progress in making data and blockchain something practical, which regular people can take advantage of, as you will hear very shortly. And on his right, you will see Jessica Federer, again, a name that many of you may know. She is an entrepreneur who left the world of big pharma not so long ago. She's a public health expert, and she was Chief Digital Officer at Bayer for several years. I was very happy to have her with me on stage on several occasions. She would every time eloquently raise the bar and set our sights higher for digital initiatives in this industry. Very good at pushing the envelope. Recently, she's actually worked as part of several startup teams, one of which is the Hugo Health, which I've mentioned. And Hugo Health is a very interesting startup. It's working with the FDA and Pharma to give customers, patients, greater control over their data. So great that you can be here, Jessica. Bottom left is Milind. Now, unfortunately, Milind's webcam isn't working today, but he is here with us. He is, I promise. He's another good friend, and recently we were on the stage together, actually, at the Vivatech conference in Paris together, tackling this very topic. In fact, it was the engagement of the audience during that event that inspired me to put today's session together and bring it to a wider audience. Milind is Chief Data Officer at Sanofi. He's capable of talking about pharma, how pharma can take advantage of anything, really, from blockchain to real-world data to quantum computing without even stopping for breath. And we're actually very fortunate to have a mind like his in our industry. So thank you so much, Milind, for being here. And last but certainly not least, sorry, I just realized I've not let these names appear. There we go. Last but not least is Jennifer. Jennifer, I'd describe as something of an ethical pioneer in the world of life sciences. She is an assistant professor at Yale, but she's also established Bioethics International, which is a non-profit dedicated to raising the bar on how we understand and operationalize bioethics and patient centricity in healthcare innovation. She's also working on a topic which is very close to my heart, which is trying to establish a code of conduct or a treaty for this industry, which will hopefully raise the bar for all. So as you can see, a great panel. And of course, I am your moderator. Excuse me for going one slide too far there. There we go. There's me. Right. So where to start? Many places we could start. But what I would like to do is maybe to talk about how this technology that we call blockchain is changing what is possible. And if you consider that blockchain is a technology that allows us to take what were quite formal systems, some very centralized systems, and decentralize them, then I think that hopefully your mind will expand onto what the sort of possibilities that we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is hand over to Richie at this point, who is going to talk a little bit more about this concept. So Richie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. First of all, Paul, congratulations. I don't know if everybody knows this about me, but about 2.5 years ago, I made a decision that I will not do panels unless there's gender balance on the panels. And so I'm really thankful that you're able to do that. And also, I don't do speaking gigs if the gender balance is not there. If the gender balance is not there, I actually charge twice. So I'm really, really happy. No, I charge double if you have more men than women on the stage. So I'm really happy that you can do that and that you're continuing that spirit. You know, I want to thank you guys for being here and thank you for inviting me. I'm truly humbled. Obviously, we're 90 days. So, you know, we're like a 90-day-old Fortune 500 company, which is moving at rocket speed. And the reception has been fantastic. At the crux of the matter is sort of this notion of decentralization. And I know we've had many conversations about blockchain, and there are many conversations ongoing about blockchain. I wanted to make sure that we sort of anchored in what the essence of the protocol is and what that essence means and how we can use it. So if you really boil blockchain down and distill it to what it does is it allows us to have a heterogeneous set of nodes. And when I say nodes, I mean people, companies, governments, machines, a heterogeneous network of nodes to agree about something. And in that agreement, everyone else in the community can see what everyone else is agreeing in real time. Okay. Now I know it's been overcomplicated 4 million times, right? And there's people talking about banana coin and Whopper coin. At the end of the day, the protocol allows heterogeneous amount of networks to agree on something and then allow everyone in that network to see what everyone else agreed. Now, the first use case of blockchain was really to get people to agree around what. So, and that has been pointed at what's the price of a coin, what's the transactional history of that coin, and what is the balance of someone's wallet, right? And if enough people can agree around that, what we noticed is that that pattern plays out in a way where something that was once agreed via centralization, meaning something like currency was once agreed only by government, right, can now be agreed on in a very decentralized way by large communities, right? That is essentially the crux of what it does. Now, if you think about history, we are in a very, very centralized form of history right now. Most things that we have to agree on, whether it's what something is or how something should work, is sort of centralized. It's in pools of power, whether that be government, a large organization, or some NGO body like the UN. Centralization is not permanent. We were once pretty decentralized. We were like savage, right? Cavemen and cavewomen and quite disorderly. And it was the argument that we can't agree on what things are and how things should work that led to governments and governance and all these large bodies. Today, for the first time in human history, we now have a technology that it doesn't easily, but it quickly and somewhat inexpensively allow us to be able to try to decentralize some of those things that came from centralization. So the first experiment is currency, all right? And obviously everybody's copycatting currency, and there's a coin here and a coin there and a coin all over the place, all agreeing on what? What we've been doing is really to try to use blockchain to agree on how something should work, not necessarily what something is. And this is very different, all right? Now, if you think about how things work, if you can go to the next slide for me, Paul, if you think about how things work, you know, there are pools of rules or power circles that sort of govern how things should work. At the tip of the spear are things like human rights, right? Which suggests that we should not do this, right? Or we should always do that. And that sort of permeates itself into, you know, sovereign opinions, and then laws and regulations, and eventually into contracts, right? This is sort of a hierarchy of how we agree on how things work. Now that we have this capacity to test how things work, what we wanted to do at Humanity.co, and I think there's a larger community building around it, is to test to see whether we can take something that's not working the way we think it should work and try to test to see whether we can decentralize it, right? And that thing that we're pointing at is this notion of whether human data is human property or not, We'll get to the healthcare part of this conversation, but that's a very broad sort of discussion that we're having, whether human data is human property. And, you know, we're sort of thinking about it as the third strategic resource of our species. There was salt, which led to maritime law. There was oil, which led to, you know, titles and deeds of land. And we believe that data should be titled and it should be treated as property, right? The same way, you know, Exxon pays for crude oil today because there's ownership of the land. We believe it's the same notion that should happen here. So we've married that into a human right. There are only 30 human rights that we have. We actually had a conversation with the United Nations. They don't have a form you could fill out for a new human right. There's not an office you can go to create the new human right. So we've established the 31st around human data being human property. And if you can go to the next slide, what we're doing now is we're pulling a large community together to be able to build this thing from the bottom up, right? Until blockchain, the way we agreed on how things should work always came top down, right? You know, the Pope will tell you, the United Nations will tell you, right? Your government will tell you, a large law firm will tell you, or Google or Facebook or one of the big companies will tell you how things should work. Here we're looking at this going, well, what if we took a specific problem and we built it from the bottom up, right? What if we can look at how things work today, and if we can figure out how to renegotiate that, we could actually bubble up the stack and create the type of change that we're looking. So when you look at the bottom right and you think about, well, how do we really receive the rules around how things work? We receive those rules in B2C contracts. We experience regulations in B2C contracts. We experience human rights in B2C contracts. That's where we get the corridor to know what we can do or what we can't do. And if you think about contracts, so my last slide, if you think about contracts, B2C contracts, I'm waiting for the slide to change there. If you think about the way contracts work, regulations are pretty wide, right? They're not explicit, they're implicit. And most of them are quite fair. They give you a wide boundary that you can operate in between of. The thing with regulations is that you could have one interpretation on one side of a regulation that's super business centric and not customer friendly, and it's valid. And you could have another opinion or another legal interpretation of regulation that's super customer centric, but not business friendly. And what's been going on is that most of the organizations that's been looking at human data as a strategic commodity and using it have been taking a very business-centric view of the law, right? Without respecting the customer. And what we're doing is we're pooling large communities together to be able to say, hey, we're not sure we like the way you interpret the law, okay? You have a very, very, very skewed interpretation of the law. Now, if myself and Jessica and Jennifer and Milind and Paul, right, sends a letter to CVS and says, hey, you can't sell my Viagra prescription, they're gonna say, you know, go take a walk. But if we and our 20 million friends sends a notice that says you can't do it, this is a large opt-out, okay? And by the way, you don't have to stop doing what you're doing. You can come back into the industry with a different regulation where you respect our data as property. We have a title for it. It has a title number, and now you have to add that number to have track and trace. We've got a whole new industry, and we've got a whole new system in place. So that's how we're looking at blockchain. That's how we're manifesting it. When we announced that we were entering the healthcare industry as our first industry, geolocation will be second, financial services will be third. I wasn't sure what reception we were going to get, but I've spoken to maybe a dozen CEOs in the last 2 weeks for everything from labs and pharmaceutical organizations. And I think, you know, the time has come, all right? And that's what we're here to talk about. So thank you for that monologue. I'll now pause and open it up.
Thank you, Richie.
That's really interesting. Can I say a quick comment?
Yes, you can.
So civil society activism, which is basically what you're talking about, has been very successful in governing business sectors and industries. So for example, you can think of the Kimberley certification and the Flipper seal of approval as results of civil society activism of the type that you're talking about. So the Kimberley certification was created in reaction to the realization by the public about conflict diamonds. And there was a lot of uprising. So the industry and others got together and created the Kimberley certification to sort of distinguish between conflict diamonds and conflict-free diamonds. And in the same way, in the 1980s, people were very upset about the tuna sector, how it was killing dolphins in the process of fishing for tuna. And so they started boycotting canned tuna, and as a result, they created the slipper seal approval. So tuna that was used with dolphin safe nets had the tuna designation. So you could imagine some kind of seal or signal for companies that used a platform like Humanity.co versus other sectors that weren't quite ready yet.
Yep. So, okay, well, that is, okay, thank you very much. What I'd like to do actually is go straight to the audience at this stage and find out whether or not you guys, based on the introduction given there, whether or not you think that this situation is going to hopefully become a reality. So if you look at your screen now, will there be real situations where we will treat personal health data as property rather than merely private? Perhaps using the blockchain as we've suggested. So I'll give you a quick second to answer this. You've got the 5 options. Yes, widespread in 1 to 2 years, so you think it'll happen quickly. Yes, widespread in 3 to 4 years. Yes, widespread in 5+ years. Or finally, it's no, it's not a desirable thing. It's not something that we want to achieve. Or finally, no, it's not a practical thing. It's actually, despite the desirability, not going to be possible for us to achieve that. So I can see that about 51% of people have voted so far. I'm going to hold that open for another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, got nearly all of you voting there. That's absolutely great. So let's have a look. Okay, we believe it will happen, quite simply. So I would say, well, nearly 90% of people say yes in some way or another. However, nearly half say that the time scale is not something that's going to happen soon, but this to many of us is clearly an inevitability, with really very small minorities saying not desirable or not practical. So let's talk about the desirability and practicality then, shall we, just for a moment. What I'd love to do is to discuss, sorry, I chose my screen rather than the webinar when I go through here. Apologies for that. Let's get back to where we want to be. Oh. There we go. Right. There's a slight delay between the button and the actual press. Let's talk about this, because public good versus individual privacy and individual benefit. When I first heard about this concept, I was pretty on the fence, because data should be free, data should be open, data is only useful when it is voluminous and it is accessible. So is this actually a good thing for us? And I'd really like to bring the discussion in with Milind and Jessica as well. Where do you guys stand on this?
Ladies first. Jessica, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think it's a long overdue discussion to talk about how people need to have access to their health data. And legally in the US, you do have a right to your health information. The challenge has been that you may get it in a paper printout or in a CD form or in a way that's completely inoperable. And so, you know, what we're on the verge of now is actually having a switch where that interoperability is now technically feasible. And that's unlocking the value of data, both for research, but also for care, and also for people to see as property. I think one of the unique considerations about health data is, though, it's a different type of property, right? So when there is an infectious disease outbreak, you want there to be widespread access to data so that you can have appropriate public response and appropriate surveillance and early action. So, you know, there's a lot of nuance in the discussion that I'm so glad that society is starting to have. Maybe it's more like property in Germany. I lived in Germany the last 9 years. You may own a forest in Germany, but legally anyone can come and hike and enjoy the beauty of the forest because it is considered a public good, which is very different than property law here in the US, where there's trespassing and somebody will shoot you. So, you know, it's about time we have the discussion of giving people access to their data, but then ensuring that we still are able to leverage that data for the protection of public health and for all of our good.
Okay. Milind.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with Jessica. I think what's interesting here is that we're talking about data as having value and data as having rights, if you will, or the individual having rights to their data. But I question at some point, though, is it the data that's really valuable, or is it the use or the utility of that data? And I think as we start thinking about, what are the incentives in the marketplace to, if you will, monetize data in this way for an individual, what are the sorts of considerations that come into play? Some things that I would consider are, well, look, yes, data should be open. I would argue probably data models are probably more relevant to be open because, frankly, even if you had all the data in the world, it really depends what you do with it to create value out of it. But as you start thinking through some of those paradigms, what you start doing with it, though, is going to largely drive new economies, if you will, in terms of how data actually gets used. I mean, if you think about it today, right, as a pharma person, and I don't know how many of the guests on the webinar today are coming from that industry, but when you really think about it, right, we generate more data than could possibly be imagined. But yet, how effective are we at truly managing that basic data? So even as organizations, we don't do very well with that. Now, if you deploy that paradigm shift directly to an individual and say, okay, now you have access to all of your data, at what point does it really become usable, utilizable, monetizable? So whilst I'm very keen for this, and I do think it's going to happen, I'm a big advocate of it, as you know, I do think, though, at some point, the economic conditions under which we start monetizing this data is largely going to be driven by utility, and public benefit alone is not a good enough incentive.
I would just add to that. Oh, sorry.
Go for it.
That's a really good point. I think if you want to talk about data as a right, you also have to talk about the infrastructure that we need to build in order to make data usable. So Jessica mentioned about inoperable data. I think there's a problem with interoperability, right? So if you just look in the healthcare sector, only 18.7% of hospitals have used data from another healthcare system. And so you have to ask why, right? Because in many cases, they do have an ability to access patient electronic health records. And part of the reason is that many healthcare systems are using different software systems, or even if they're using the same one like Epic, they're customizing them in such a way that they're not interoperable. So if we want to talk about using data for the common good or for the good of humanity and for all the reasons that have been mentioned, we need to build the data infrastructure. And it's not surprising that we don't have it, sort of in defense of us, in that the data volume has expanded exponentially. If you just think about genome data, right, 10 years ago in 2007, we had only fully sequenced 2 people's genomes. I think it was Watson, and I'm blanking on the second person, Craig Venter. 10 years later, by 2017, we're up to 400,000 genomes. And so, of course, as we're gathering more data, we need to start building that infrastructure, that data highway.
Yeah, one of the things I love this conversation. I wake up, I eat this, I live this, I breathe it, I sleep it. One of the things that we are keen on is that we're capturing the consent in the consent part of the blockchain around each individual to really make those decisions around how you would like your data to be used. All right. So we're still fine-tuning our choice architecture before we launch in August. But one of the things we're doing in the choice architecture is you can decide whether you want to explicitly remove an assumption of your authorization to de-identify your data, right? Which is a quarter within HIPAA that's legal today. We don't need the law changed for that. We just need enough people to do it. The second is, if you don't want to actually opt out only and you would like to opt in, the question is, how would you like to opt in? Would you like your data to be donated for the American Cancer Research, right? Would you like your data to be used for public utility if certain benefits can come from it? And if your data is used for commercial purposes, are you willing to sort of lease it in an annual lease, right? You're titled to it. Are you willing to, give it away for a full price? Are there aspects of it that you would never want shared? Like psychiatry, for example, right? I don't want people to definitely have evidence that I'm crazy. It's okay that they assume that I am, right? So we're building out the choice architecture into the fabric to make sure that once an individual gets the title to their information, they can sort of then decide what that looks like. And one of the reasons we're working with ethicists and other types of organizations like that is that's a big question. right? It's a big question to answer. These are questions that are bigger than one organization. The entire industry has to come together and sort of solve for those questions. I think that's something that I think we should probe on. The second thing, which I think is super interesting here, is that access, access is like shooting for, what's farther, the moon or the stars, right? Access is like shooting for the moon, right? Property is shooting for the stars, right? Most patients, and it's research on research on research, and we've conducted our own, yeah, they want access to the data, but they don't know what to do with it, right? It actually drives hypochondria. I happen to be married to a healthcare provider. Every time I look at my own stuff, I'm like, I'm definitely sick. And she's like, no, 6 is good. You don't have to be a 0 to be good, right? So access to the data is not necessarily going to solve the problem. This is about property. And property is very interesting because you get benefits from property. Your stuff can't be stolen. You get to be negotiated in fair market value. We have our opening conversation with Intuit about building a form in TurboTax where people who donate their data can automatically claim that as a donation for a tax write-off. We're really talking about property here. And when you talk about interoperability or fixing silos is about allowing stolen stuff to be passed around. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about allowing the thieves of the data to continue to exchange it with each other. We need that, but we're talking about adding light to the system so that we can know who has it, who's using it, why they're using it, should they be using it, and if it's creating value, I should get value back.
Okay. I love that notion that you just mentioned of having a tax credit, because it is recognizing that participating in research, which that's been the core foundation of advancing science for so long, are these unspoken silent volunteers that participate in clinical trials and give their data. And the least you could do is give them a tax write-off for that donation of their health information. Yeah. But I think one of the aspects that often gets overlooked is the complexity of harmonizing and normalizing the data that comes from Cerner and Epic and different systems, together with the data that comes from different pharmacy systems, together with the data that comes from your wearable Fitbit, together with the data that comes from your implantable cardiac device, and bringing that all together with your labs and scans in a way that the data from the different systems shows up in the same format, so it's usable and meaningful. And I was at the Precision Medicine Leader Summit yesterday. We were talking about, how do we harness the promise of all of this electronic data to actually improve clinical care. And one of the physicians there put up a slide with a picture of 2 children hooked up to all these different monitors and machines in the NICU. And he's a pediatric surgeon, and he was saying, just off these 2 kids, there's 1,400 data points that he has to go through and make sense of. And to normalize that and make sense of it, you need AI, you need machine learning, you need advanced systems to help you make sense of that data. The data in itself, yes, it's meaningful and it's valuable, but it's not until you bring it together in a very particular way that it actually helps. And they talked about it like digging for a diamond bracelet in a dumpster. It's possible to find it, but it's really time consuming and messy. And you mentioned Hugo when you introduced me. Hugo Health is, I think, one of those gems that's helping the FDA and Big Pharma bring all of those pieces together and tackle the really unsexy, unglamorous work of going behind the scenes and connecting all of those systems, so that when people enter the system, all of their data to them, it looks like magic. It comes together and it's normalized. But behind the scenes, there's so much complexity that goes into that is needed before the data becomes valuable property.
Yeah, but I think we're having 2 conversations here. There's no question that merging data together and driving interoperability is both difficult and important. I think that's you can't debate against that. Okay. One of the reasons why that is happening in this industry specifically, we're seeing different things in geolocation, and we're definitely seeing different things in financial services. I'll be happy to tell you how messed up financial services is. Healthcare is actually not as bad as financial services, right? In financial services, you paid the bank already. The credit reporting agencies can't get it right, so you have to take the average of the 3, right? And there's a whole industry built around it to go fix your data with them because 30% has errors, and then when you want it, you have to go pay them for it, right? But that's a whole different story, okay? In healthcare specifically, one of the challenges with interoperability in healthcare is that there is a number of organizations in the center of the industry that are not acting in the best interest of pharma or acting in the best interest of the patient. It's kind of unfortunate that pharma has such a burden to carry from a trust perspective.
Yeah.
Right? Because pharma's brands are recognizable. And so the patient's like, I hate the healthcare industry, and they're pointing, at pharma. The problem is actually being created in the middle of the industry. It's actually not being created in the edges. And the issue with the problem, and why we want to solve it this way, is that there's been leaps of faith, right? EMR companies, labs have taken a huge leap of faith by having business associate agreements with hospitals and doctors that exchanges free software for the rights to de-identify patient data and sell it. Now, let me tell you what the problem is with that. One is, I'm married to a healthcare provider, okay? If I take out the garbage in the morning, she gets to her patients faster, okay? Can I exchange that service in exchange for her patient's data so I can go sell it? No, you can't do that, okay? Now, we did that so that we can have patient data, but we have the patient data in a de-identified format. And that de-identified format is the culprit, or the largest culprit, in the absence of interoperability. It's the fact that it's de-identified that makes it so complex to pull together. So what we are doing is that when people declare their right as they own this as property, they exercise the existing corridor of the law to remove your assumption of explicit authorization, which the law allows us to do. The invite back will give you the consent and the authorization to use the data without de-identifying it. And what I think excites pharma is this notion to be able to have data in a corridor that is clean, that has clean consent and authorization, that where the data does not have to be de-identified, with a beautiful trusted relationship with the patient, taking the middle out, because the middle is what's creating the problem.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I would just add, I hear we're all very excited about the value of data, right? Data has been called the new oil, has incredible value. And so, there's some land grabbing around the data. We want access, and let's create these pathways for maximizing access. At the same time, I hear concerns about the rights of the individual. I want to talk about the individual for a little bit. I don't think we should talk for all individuals, but the sense is from studies and from just looking at who's opting into sharing data, that we have a huge trust problem, right? And Richie, you mentioned this. And I want to ask, how is this new system where we give property rights to individuals going to ameliorate or address the huge gap in trust around how our data is being used? And then not only how are we going to address trust, but how are we going to make the system trustworthy, right? As I've mentioned to Richie several times, you can trust a used car salesman who sells you a lemon. So we don't want to just introduce trust, we want to introduce trustworthiness into the system, merited trust. And the second piece is, why would that be important? Well, again, going back just the genomic data, but this is representative of most types of data. The data that we do have right now is often very biased. Not even talking about the algorithmic analyses of data, which also have their own inherent biases, which need audits, by the way. Just looking at genomic data, 80% of the genomic data we have right now tends to be Caucasian data, right? We're often not getting minority, either ethnic, racial, other types of minorities opting into systems voluntarily, or whatever reason we don't have data generated from them. So how will this system help reduce biases in data, and how will it improve trustworthiness for the individual who's thinking about sharing their data?
Yeah, I think the question was pointed to me, but I'd love to have Milind chime in here, because I hear him coming in with the breathing.
Well, my apologies. I'm just loving the dialogue. Look, I think there's a couple of trust things here. To me, this is a version 1 of what we've done with data transparency. If you think about it, when we sign up for a lot of online services, if you will, whether it be through social networks, whether it be through bank transactions, etc., we're trading off convenience for the exchange of our information and agreement, which none of us really read. The agreement to use our information in whatever shape or form is appropriate. I think with the, between both Cambridge Analytica and between just the ways in which we've seen politics and the utility of data either be used for good or nefarious reasons, the reality is that this data has been misused. And so what we've reached a level now is, I don't think trust has been broken. We voluntarily gave up that trust in exchange for consumerism. And so now you've reached a stage where we said, well, actually, we still want consumerism, but we want a different form of consumerism now. And, I'm just kind of reflecting on the dialogue around, what was swimming in my head was trust, and pharma forever has been trying to gain trust in the markets, right, in terms of either pricing and so forth. But this trust fundamentally is about data. But when you think about trust and doing it even in an environment like blockchain or through data as a property, is more about, it's not a competitive edge, right? I think that's the point I want to make here. For any pharma to be first out of the gates, honestly, who gives it? Whatever, right? It's not about being first out of the gates. It's about doing this as an industry body because it's the right thing to do, right? And when you start doing the right things, you start gaining trust. And as long as you're being transparent in the utility of that data, then fine. I would argue the same holds true for algorithms. When you look at algorithms today, it frustrates the daylights out of me why we pay exorbitant amounts of money for algorithms when they're already so democratized, right? That, we've reached a certain point in time where not only the democratization of data exists, but the democratization of algorithms exist, but what has not come into the foray, which is a natural evolution of where we are today, is the democratization of real trust and transparency. And this might just be the first of many steps to reach there. I don't think this is a holy grail, but it's the first of many steps that's going to evolve. But I do think it's the right thing to do, and it's not about developing a competitive edge, because when you gain trust, you gain value, period.
I love Jen's. I was just going to say, Jen, I love your question, and that's something that, with Hugo pulling together data from all different sources, it's the individual that owns that data. So then when the individual participates in a study, they are able to see through blockchain who's accessing the data, when and how and where, and they've given explicit permission for specific parts of that data to be used for that study. So it's really a special way for pharma to move from seeing people as research subjects in a trial to seeing them as partners. And then, imagine, because you have this ongoing relationship directly with the individual and they have control over their integrated data, you can imagine that after a 2-year, 3-year real-world evidence study is over, if a question comes up, you can actually reach back out to those people because those individuals are your research partners, not a big CRO. So it's really, I think it is changing the trust relationship through transparency, through that sunlight. And finally, we're able to do that now because technology is advanced to a level where that's possible.
So sunlight is a good disinfectant. Justice Brandeis said that very well. I guess I would just caution a little bit. So I love the opt-out system, right? Something goes wrong and you can opt out, right? You can say, I'm not going to patronize this. I'm not going to share my data or sell my data to this individual type of this company or this sector because I've had a bad experience. The problem is you've opted out because you've had a bad experience, right? Now let's hope that that bad experience is not too costly. So let's just think about credit card companies. Sometimes when they have access to your data, they will profile you, right? Algorithmic profiling based on data. I know of a couple credit cards, if you go and shop at certain companies where people are known to have poor repayment histories, right? Just by the fact that I go in there and I use, I shop there too, it can affect the way that that company profiles me and my credit worthiness, right? And we've had tons of cases where MasterCard, for example, blurred the credit history of one African-American man who owned a business and a house just because he went and shopped at a place like Walmart, right? I don't know if it was Walmart, but something like that. And so I wonder for Hugo and Humanity.co, are there going to be any restrictions on or any disclosures and transparency around the uses of the data, right? How will people know how their data is going to be used? And then is there a difference between opting out once a scandal or problem has occurred or being more proactive in preventing those types of problems?
I can say for the research side for Hugo, only IRB approved studies go onto the platform. So there is a pre-screen. So the institutional review board for a study has to approve, and then the individual has to consent to share that data and participate in the study. So it's very similar to the precautions that are taken for a research study today. Richie, how is it for humanity?
For us, we're not looking to clean up the small parts of the industry, right? We're not a healthcare company, right? We are in the business of digital property. So we're looking at all industries across this. So we know that pharma enjoys explicit consent in small groups around research, and that's fantastic. We're looking at the entire population, right? And the choice architecture is something that is very, very important here. We're probably going to have a bit of an a la carte choice architecture where you allow your data for certain uses, but not for others. But the research is still unfolding, and the research is really interesting. So we found that I think 86% of people are willing to let the pharmaceutical industry use their data, okay, for commercial purposes if they know that they can see when it's used, and the lease time is transparent, right? And of course, they receive consideration back. What's interesting to the study, though, is when we use specific company names like Pfizer versus GSK or Sanofi or Amgen, the variation is insane, right? Well, some brands are performing at only 14% of people are like, yeah, I'm willing to share it with XYZ brand, and other brands are performing well. So this is really interesting. And again, we have this humongous responsibility in our hands here with this invention. I think we're going to see millions of downloads and claims, and I think the notification is going to be in the tens of millions. But the responsibility, Jen, is tremendous, and I don't know that we're ready to sort that responsibility out. I don't think we know enough. I don't think we have a broad enough stakeholder community around it. We're inviting pharma, we're inviting other actors in other industries to help us with that, but I don't have the answer, and we certainly at Humanity Code doesn't have the answer. We're simply shining a light on the problem and allowing the community to remove this assumption of explicit authorization, express how they would like to engage with the industry, and act as an entire community back. Now, the marketplace on top of that with intelligent contracts facilitates pricing and all sorts of stuff like that. You'd be surprised. Some people think they should be paid $2,000 a year for their data. Some people are okay being paid $20 a year, right? So this is a completely new industry design, completely new model. We're still researching. We're figuring out as we go. But it's not just these companies that are on this webinar to figure out. We have to act as an industry here and try to figure out these difficult problems.
Okay, that's a useful place to say that we do need to talk more in the remaining minutes here about pharma and indeed how this industry is going to work. I am conscious that we've already gone through more than 2/3 of this webinar. We haven't brought the audience in a huge amount as yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch one more of these poll questions, which I think is quite topical for what we've just been talking about. So if you look at your screen right now, if health data is treated as individual property, how will that impact pharma's business? So I just want an idea right now whether that's going to be positive, neutral, or negative in your opinion. Obviously speaking from the point of view of a pharma manager, whether you are one or not. So what is your opinion on whether or not that will be positive, neutral, or negative for the pharmaceutical company in the long term? So over the course of a few years here, as opposed to immediately, because obviously there will be some disruption immediately. So again, I'm getting some good percentages here, more than half of you already. Let's hold it open for 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, got about 3/4 of you there. So let's have a look at the results. Okay, so it's not a clear win, but it is a good win. Positively is obviously the winner here. So a good 46%, nearly half of you, 1/3 people saying neutral, and just under 1/4 saying negatively. So there is a feeling that that will be positive. Now before, and I'm sure the panel want to talk about this, but before we do that, I am indebted to our audience for sending in quite a few very interesting questions. Thank you to those of you who have been. By the way, I mean, I'm getting a huge volume of questions actually, and the truth is that we're not going to be able to cover them all in the next 15 minutes. So I don't know if the panel would be willing, but given the clear interest in this, would you be willing to help maybe answer some of these questions offline afterwards? And audience, could you please let me know, just write a quick yes or no into the Q&A box, into the question box, Would it be of value if we tried to write some of this stuff down and address some of those questions? Just give me a yes or a no. If I can see the demand is there, then it legitimizes me asking these guys for some of their time. So I'm going to read out a few of these. Oh, thank you. I'm getting hundreds of yeses. Okay, fine. Right, done. Okay, now I can't read the questions because my page keeps scrolling. Let me read out a few audience questions. I'll leave it to the panel as to whether they comment on the data in front of them with these graphs, or whether they'd like to take one of these audience questions. So data is different from diamonds because diamonds can't be duplicated at will. How do we prevent data from leaving authorized systems? This is the core of the trust issue. Companies who've been trusted cannot assure that the data will remain secure. Once data is separated from the blockchain, it can be weaponized. How can blockchain technology affect this? Another key question, which is one that I found myself asking myself, is how do we educate the general population regarding the value of their data? And I'll actually add on top of that, particularly given the discussion we had where the raw data itself is often not particularly useful. It's often only in combination, whether with other data or whether with the sort of analytics tools that are available to us now, or the open-minded thinking that we might produce as a result of this data, that is actually the thing of most value. So how do we place a value on that? And Richie already covered that point, but how do we actually educate the population as to whether or not the property has some value? Obviously, we're sensitive to it. Cambridge Analytica, thanks to them for that, but we haven't necessarily put any value on it before. How do you envisage data attribution working between patients and companies? For example, CVS in their normal course of business creates a record of when they pick up their prescription. Does the record of the data belong to the patient or the CVS? So where does the data, what kind of data lies? And there are many permutations of that question. With patients as partners, could you see physicians being disintermediated in future clinical trials, i.e. pharma just works with patients directly, as this empowerment, as it is a form of empowerment, actually continues and gains traction? So that's just a small taste of some of the questions I've been given so far. I could actually carry on and certainly do another 5 or 10, but who wants to tackle what?
This is Richie. I'd like to take the second question around the value of the data and the utility of it. I'm assuming more than half of the audience has drank coffee before, or has driven a car, okay, which consumes gasoline. This pattern of paying for a crude natural resource is not new, right? When Exxon pays for crude oil, they add a lot of value and ingredients to the crude oil to turn it into gasoline, right? Or when that's used to make other materials, there's tons of things that go into it to create value. That's an added value, right? But it doesn't mean that the crude oil, because it's property, doesn't have title, okay? So that's the first thing. That's why I said if you drove a car, you'll understand this metaphor. If you drank coffee, you'll understand this metaphor as well. Coffee beans are not that useful. You can't really do that much with them, okay? But you still pay for them, and Starbucks still pays for them to do something to actually turn it into coffee so that I could be as excited as I am right now, right? So I think the education to the grand population is very, very, very easy. We're testing ads, okay, that are very, very simple. Our ads are, have you used a Fitbit? Yes? Okay, well, sign up for this app because we can give you title to that data. We're gonna go get money for you, okay? And so you have to think about, can you go to the chart with the one chart where it looks like this? When you think about the data itself, right? There are various categories of data that are probably clearly our property, but not all of them require consideration. This is a very, very important topic. Paul, I was looking for the chart where you have sort of the bars on the left and the bars on the right.
Would it be this
one?
So
right, this one. Yes. So if you draw a Pareto chart, okay, of data sets, on the left-hand side of that Pareto chart are data sets where, you know, the value is high and you paid for the service. And on the right-hand side of that chart are data sets where the value is low and you didn't pay for the service. What you'll notice is that on the right-hand side of the chart are things like Facebook, okay? Yes, your status is probably your property, okay? But it's really not that valuable, and you're getting a service in exchange for it. The service is a platform to perpetuate your vanity, okay? But on the left side of that chart are things like your electronic healthcare records, where you paid the doctor, you paid CVS, you paid Walgreens, you paid LabCorp, you paid Quest Diagnostics, and it is the byproduct of a transaction that you paid for that's being monetized to the tune of $50 billion a year globally. That's the argument that we're making. And then in the middle is stuff like Pandora is selling my geolocation data and my and my musical habits to figure out whether I need clothes that look like 80s love songs, right, or hip hop. Okay, so we have to be very sober about this conversation. We're not saying all data requires consideration, but the healthcare industry, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll take a crack at that.
Question. Either that or.
I'll take a crack at the question about whether this type of technology would remove the physician as an intermediary. I'm not sure that the physician is the data broker right now, right? So usually a physician is part of a healthcare system, and it's the healthcare system that often decides what happens to the health data. So for example, Yale Health has some partnerships with Flatiron, and it would be Yale that makes the decision about Yale Health. What happens to electronic health records, not the individual, necessarily the individual physician. So in that sense, the doctor's not the data broker or the intermediary. And then I'd also say that there are different types of health data, right? There's data that's generated from a clinical trial for an initial use approval, right? So like a new molecular entity versus data that you might need for a new use approval. Not a new molecular entity, but a new use of an already approved product. For initial use products, you're probably still going to need a couple, at least, randomized controlled trials or some type of controlled trial. And there you would generally need a physician enrolling patients and caring for them, and an investigator physician and collecting data. There you're probably not going to get rid of that investigator physician. In the new use approval data, there you could use some more electronic health records, mining adverse events, and then the off-label prescribing. And there you might reduce the role there you might increase the role of primary care and the healthcare system of opting into sharing data.
Yeah, and I would add to what Jen is saying on the research side. Most of the research is done. We've all used ParExcel or Quintiles or one of the big entities. I think for now it's not replacing them, but if you take the relationship and you put it out into the future, if the pharma company does have a trust-based, blockchain audited relationship with the individual to request and receive access to data, and it's done in a very transparent way, I do think you'll see that relationship changing and evolving. Because right now, if you do a study with ParExcel, you can't go back to those individuals 15 years later and say, actually, that device we implanted in you, we want to look at a little more data. You don't have that relationship. But in this new world where the company, through a Hugo type platform, has a direct relationship with the individual, you really can go back years later. And because those people are part of a community of individuals, a community taking the same medicine, a community having the same pacemaker implanted. You're building communities and helping them to shift the power and shift the relationship in this research-based industry.
And Jess, I'm in complete agreement. And the reason why you can't go back to the patient is not because of Quintiles or ParExcel or any of the CROs. It's because the industry is in an outdated design. The industry is a design where it made an assumption that it didn't have to ask the patient for explicit authorization to use the data, and an entire industry of douchebags, have assembled around de-identified data. And now pharma is in a position where they cannot have a relationship back with the patient because of that massive flaw in the industry design. We are empowering people to remove that assumption of explicit authorization by inviting the industry back to be able to now participate in a market where pharma does not have to worry about HIPAA compliance, because you have the explicit consent, and the middle of the industry now has to really play nice. The margins are about 80% in the middle, guys. Yes. This is not easy to pay. This is not difficult to pay patients a part of that. Plus, there are tons of value pathways that pharma will benefit from to be able to have explicit consent for the patient records to pass that value back to the patient. We're actually one of the only companies in the world that I know whose business model is to give people money, right, to get it from where it is. And my call to action to the industry here is really, really, really simple. Everybody's reached out to us already. Michael and I and the rest of the team, we can barely deal with the inbounds that are coming in, okay? There's 3 call to actions. One is, if you would like to write about this or talk about it at a conference, call us. We got tons of content, right, to help you drive that agenda. That's number 1. Number 2, if you want to find out more information about who pays and how it works, etc., we have a ton of information we'll be publishing in about 2 weeks around how the architecture is going to work. We'll be inviting folks around that. We're talking to system integrators to make sure that this thing can be integrated in fast form. But the third is the one that's closest to my heart. We need people to join us. If you're looking for a job, and we still have space on the cap table because of the high valuation we're getting, okay? And we got a couple of tens of millions of options that we can still give people. If you're looking for a job and you want to be in the future, join us.
All right, Richie. All right, Richie.
Commercial.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. I have to pause it there. We've only got 3 minutes left, and we haven't got a huge amount of time to have much discussion. I'm aware there's a couple of very important World Cup matches starting very shortly. If you're German, Swedish, then you'll be one there. There are a lot more questions that just come in the last few minutes. People, if there's one thing that it seems that people are missing, it's a better understanding of blockchain, which is obviously the first word on the title of this webinar, and how blockchain is actually going to be useful, not just in this situation, but as a trust catalyst. And whether there's any other examples, perhaps from Milind or other panelists who not talked so much about the specific data case, could actually derive this. So have you got a 1 minute answer for that, please?
Yeah, if you want to learn about what blockchain is, there's tons of clickbait out there that shows more than enough examples to show what blockchain actually is in very, very simple terms. Richie's TED Talk, I think, is an example if you need to go see some clickbait, right? But there's one there. But all outside of that, though, use cases in pharma are pretty straightforward, right? But I think it's more the practical applications and readiness of it. I keep hearing around track and trace initiatives and being able to do anti-counterfeit. Yes and no. Where anti-counterfeit is the greatest is in countries with really poor bandwidth. So don't go shoving an internet hogger into places with low bandwidth. It's kind of stupid. You also need to, and when SMS actually frankly works just as fine, right? I think, be practical about the applications. The whole data transparency piece, again, don't look at this as being something that's going to make your company even better or somewhat more profound. It's an industry movement, guys. It's not about being competitive here.
Yeah.
It's about doing the right thing, right? Last but not least, I certainly do see applications of the way in which we can transform clinical trials, how you onboard patients much earlier into the system. I think that's a huge benefit because now you can maintain a patient relationship even post a clinical trial. Once they're actually back, if you will, in the real world. So those are just some of the examples I would say. But I think anything generally around where you believe that trust has been lost in some shape or form, and I'm not talking about marital instances and things like that, but frankly, areas
clarify.
more,
thank you,
right? I just had to put it out there, right? But look, but I think if you're working in our industry, I think areas where we're not getting the visibility on how our information is being used, I think those are the opportunities that you should tackle first, in whatever shape or form. Even just simple contracting, right? I mean, I'll tell you what, being on our side of the team, and this is not a discredit to Sanofi in any shape or form, but sometimes just looking for, did we even sign this, and where is that contract, right? Those are the sorts of simple things that I think could just make a profound impact just in operational effectiveness.
Okay. I'm afraid we've hit the hour. I want to respect everybody's time. We could easily talk about this for another hour, and certainly this is just the first of several blockchain webinars that we hope to be having, but I think this has been a very fascinating discussion has taken you from probably zero to hero on a topic that you hadn't necessarily taken a huge amount of time to consider, but one which will undoubtedly become more and more important going forward. If this has been a useful discussion, then do carry on. We can do it face-to-face in any of these locations. We also have an event in October this year, which is not listed here, which is all about real-world data use and how that's becoming the platform in the US. So please do check that out. And then if any of the people on this call have fascinated, if you want to follow up the conversation, say thank you, send messages of love and endearment, then feel free. You can do so by just contacting them on one of the details that you'll see in front of you right now. And I'm sure that you'll eventually get a response from that once the backlog has been cleared. Okay, really appreciate everyone's time. That's not just our 5 panelists, if you include me, who've really given up their time, energy and ideas to make this a really fascinating discussion, but also to everybody who's actually been a very interactive part of the session. Good luck if you're watching soccer, football now, and for the rest of you, enjoy the rest of your day. This is just the beginning, as you can well see, and there's going to be a fascinating discussion and journey to go on after this. See you soon.